What you're looking at here is a piece of beauty. This right here is supposedly the first generation Crane Speedway toilet. Now, in general, blowout toilets can be kind of tiresome after you see so many. They all seem kind of formulaic, and some of them are worse than others. But this one has a interesting charm to it, and I want to see why. Let's start with the overall design, which is quite interesting. I really do find it quite interesting how this is designed. Like, it looks like an octagon base, and it just kind of flattens out. And then you got this passage over here, which is to be the siphon jet. Here is the opening, which looks a bit weird, not gonna lie. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the first generation Crane Trapway also has something similar to this opening. Well, I can't really get a good view of them. The rim jets are unfortunately pointed out, which is not really surprising for a blowout toilet. That's typical for most. Which means the bow rinse isn't the greatest. Another thing I'd like to point out is the Speedway logo. Notice how there's no crane. With at least this one, which is quite interesting. Alright, let's see how this thing flushes. The blowout flush is kind of typical, but I do like the emphasis on the pull with the front jets, which is pretty cool. While it's kind of common with most, this one seems a little bit more exciting than most, and I can't really explain why. Now, regarding performance, it seems to perform pretty well. I don't ever see this thing clogging, especially considering you got this slightly large opening. It looks kind of small at first, then you kind of see this U shape, which is quite interesting. In fact, it looks like a coin tip if you look at it closely. Which is definitely a better opening compared to the second generation, which is pretty tight. Let's have a look at the bow rinse. Well, admittedly, the bow rinse doesn't look to be the greatest. At least it seems to cover at least most of the rim, which is nice. And that is the first generation Crane Speedway toilet. But now it's time to see how it goes into the grading scale. Let's grade it. I definitely think the overall design of this toilet is very fascinating to me. This toilet was made in the early 1900s, yet it looked pretty ahead of its time when you think about it. Sure, to most people now it just looks like a standard vintage toilet, but keep in mind, this design was not very common in the early 1900s, but more or so rather the mid-1900s, from the 40s to the 60s. This toilet honestly looks like it would fit right in, but it's not. It's an older design that was used up until the 1930s, which is pretty fascinating. I really do like the design. I guess the only complaint I really do have, which won't really knack it that much, is the channel passages for the siphon jet. They just look kind of ridiculous with how bloated they are. But besides that, the design is pretty cool for its age, and it gets an 8. The quality control is just okay. That's all I really got to say about this toilet. I think some of the biggest problems are some of the crooked jets that this have, from the rim jets to sometimes even the siphon jet as seen on this one, which I find very weird. Honestly, both the Crane and Trenton Potteries seem to be about on par with each other with its quality control, and overall I have to give it a 6. Could have been better, but could have been worse. Consistency seems to be pretty on par. Like I mentioned, the quality control might drag this down a little bit due to some of its crookedness every now and then, but besides that, it seems to be fairly consistent, and I give it a 7. You know, the first time I looked at this Trapway, I was like, I don't know about this design. Then you kind of look at it more, and it's a lot bigger than you might expect. For one thing, although the Trapway opening looks small, it's actually a lot deeper than you might expect. And the Trapway itself is fairly large. I mean, it's honestly shocking how large it is, if you think about it. But this side profile from a Crane catalog should probably show how big this Trapway is. It's fairly large. I give it an 8 overall. The flush on this is just okay. That's all I can really say about this. If you've seen a blowout toilet before, they flush pretty much all the same, and this toilet is no different, unfortunately. However, I will give credit to this one thing, the flushing sound. If you've seen a blowout toilet before, you can know that these can be fairly loud. Well, honestly, this one is quite different. This is probably one of the most quiet flushing blowout toilets I have ever heard. While it doesn't sound like much, I mean, you just have to listen to the flush sound to really get what I'm hinting at. The second generation that came after this was pretty loud compared to this. Meanwhile, this, for a blowout toilet, is quite quiet, which is very shocking, honestly. Overall, the flush gets a 6. For a blowout toilet, this should not be shocking. It pulls pretty well. Not only does this thing have front jets to help pull things down, it also has a siphon jet to assist it as well. I don't really note these having shredding problems as far as I'm aware, but it may happen from time to time. But thankfully, it seems to be fairly rare, and only on certain circumstances. I give it a 7. This thing performs fairly good. Even though the opening doesn't look all that promising, it's definitely a lot deeper than you might think, which is pretty great in the long run. Which I can't really say the same for the second generation that came after that, but that's a story for another day. Overall, the performance is pretty great, and I have to give it a 9. Okay, I was expecting the bowruns to not be that good, but for what it is, it seems alright. Granted, it has pointed down jets, which is a big pet peeve of mine, but it seems to cover most, if not all, the bowl pretty well. The angle down ram jets, though, probably just don't really help it out all that much, but overall I give it a 6. Excluding the age of these things can last for a fairly good long time, due to its larger trapway and pretty good reliability. I don't see most of these going anywhere anytime soon, excluding scum evasions, which is a completely different topic for another day. Survivability gets an 8. Now let's talk about the overall value of this toilet. I definitely think the most fascinating thing is just how interesting the design is. From the trapway opening being completely weird, to the strange overall design for the time period that this was made in. Keep in mind, made in the early 1900s. Definitely one of the strangest blowout toilets I've ever seen. I am glad that Crane carried on Trenton Potteries' legacy for a little bit longer. Excluding the fact that this is just your typical blowout toilet at the end of the day, this thing does have some redeeming qualities, like the pull factor being fairly decent, the performance being pretty great, and even some of the more lacking aspects are definitely better than some other toilets. This thing definitely has it all, and it's definitely one of the most fascinating blowout toilets I have ever seen. Overall, it gets a 7 in value. The final score of the first generation Trenton Potteries Speedway, or the first generation Crane Speedway toilet, is a 72 out of 100. This is definitely one of the most fascinating toilets I've ever seen, from its weird design, weird execution, and just overall quirkiness. Makes me like this thing a lot more than I probably would have originally. Sure, it's a pretty standard blower at the end of the day, but this thing definitely has some redeeming factors, and honestly, it's just a really cool toilet, especially for the time period that this was made. Definitely one of a kind.